"You can't be here," the guard barked, his voice slicing through the lobby like a serrated blade. Funny thing is, I'd been invited by the state bar itself. The fluorescent lights above hummed, their cold, steady flicker making the marble floor beneath my shoes seem even more sterile. My name badge, issued not 10 minutes earlier by the receptionist, still hung from my lapel like a silent witness. I was here to deliver a keynote address on civil rights law, a subject I had lived, breathed, and defended in court for over a decade. Yet here I was, my back pressed against a polished column, as a white security guard in a starch-stiff uniform closed in on me like I was trespassing. His hands hovered too close to his belt, where a black baton and a can of pepper spray waited like old, eager friends. "Sir, I work here," I began, my voice low, steady, as though reason might crack through whatever wall he'd already built in his mind. "No, you don't." His eyes locked onto my skin first, my suit second, and the words that came next were quieter, more dangerous. "You people always have some excuse." 1,000 courtroom arguments flashed through my head, all the precedents, the motions, the constitutional clauses I could quote without thinking. None of them mattered here. Not in this moment. Not to him. "Do you want to see my bar card?" I asked, already reaching for my wallet. My movements were slow, deliberate. I'd argued enough wrongful search and seizure cases to know exactly how quickly this could go bad. "Put your hands where I can see them," he snapped, his right hand brushing the handle of his baton. Now, and that's how it began. That's how I found myself pinned against the marble, wrists in cold steel, the weight of a knee pressing into my spine. The humiliation didn't come from the stairs, though they burned into me like 1,000 tiny brands. It came from the silence. No one spoke up. The receptionist who'd handed me my badge 20 minutes earlier avoided my eyes. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped around us like we were a spilled cup of coffee. The only sounds were the clink of the handcuffs and the guard's ragged breathing. When they finally dragged me to the security office, the smell hit first: stale coffee, sweat, and the faint tang of cleaning chemicals that never quite masked the scent of fear. A camera in the corner blinked red, recording. "You're being detained on suspicion of trespassing," the guard announced, his voice carrying the smug finality of someone who believed they'd just completed a civic duty. "I'm here to speak at the Bar Association conference," I said, fighting to keep my tone calm. "Your superior can confirm. Don't bother. We'll let the police sort it out." I laughed, then short, bitter, and humorless. "Do you know how many cases I've handled against this exact kind of nonsense?" He leaned in, his breath hot with stale coffee. "Guess you'll be handling one more." The police came. They were marginally less aggressive, but no less dismissive. My briefcase was searched without consent. My phone was taken. My wrists stayed cuffed. I was let out a side door so the conference attendees wouldn't see the disturbance. Booking was a blur: fingerprints, a mugshot, paperwork thick enough to choke a shredder. My release came hours later, only after a junior prosecutor recognized my name and called someone higher up. No apology. No explanation. Just a court date. And that court date, by some cosmic joke, was the very next morning. I arrived early, wearing the same suit, though the creases now had the stubborn wrinkles of a night spent in my home office preparing my own defense. I'd been in hundreds of courtrooms, but this one felt different. My pulse wasn't steady. My breath came in shallow, quiet pulls. The bailiff's voice broke through the murmurs. "All rise." I rose, and then I saw him. The man in the black robes, the man holding the gavel, was the same man who had pinned me to the marble floor hours earlier. The security guard. No, not just the security guard. The Honorable Judge Matthew Cray. For a moment, neither of us moved. His eyes darted, recognition flaring before it was smothered by judicial composure. The courtroom seemed to shrink, the wooden benches leaning in, the fluorescent lights suddenly warmer, heavier. "Mr. Hale," he said, his voice even. "You're here representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, letting the honorific cut like a blade between my teeth. A flicker almost imperceptible crossed his face. The kind of flicker that meant this wasn't supposed to happen, not in his tidy little version of the world. The prosecutor, a young woman with sharp eyes and a voice like clipped steel, began her statement. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended on the premises of a restricted government building, which I was invited to." I interjected. She bristled and refused to comply with lawful orders to leave. I asked him if he wanted to see my credentials, I said, looking straight at the judge. He refused. Judge Cray cleared his throat. Mr. Hale, you'll have your turn. Oh, I think it is my turn, I said, my voice carrying enough to make the jurors, God help them. They looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, shift uncomfortably. I had every intention of keeping my argument clinical. Law, precedent, procedure. But as I stood there, staring into the face of the man who'd treated me like a criminal for existing in his line of sight, something shifted. This case, I began, isn't about trespassing. It's not about security protocols. It's about a man who saw my skin and decided it was a threat. And now, that same man sits in judgment of me. The room tightened. You could feel the way people suddenly forgot to breathe, the way the air seemed to bend around the weight of truth. I've defended clients in this courtroom, and others like it across the state. I've argued constitutional law at the appellate level. I've been invited to speak about civil rights at conferences, law schools, and legislative hearings. But none of that mattered yesterday. Not to this man. My gaze didn't leave his. Yesterday, I was just another black man in a suit. I saw his knuckles tighten around the gavel. His jaw clenched just slightly. But he didn't speak. And in that silence, I felt the entire courtroom shift, jurors, spectators, even the stenographer leaning in ever so slightly, as though the story unfolding in front of them had just stopped being legal procedure and started being something else entirely. The prosecutor straightened her papers, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Your Honor, she said, the defense is attempting to make this personal. It is personal. I shot back before she could continue. When a person in a position of authority abuses that authority, it becomes personal to everyone who could be next. This isn't just my story, it's a warning. Judge Cray's voice was steady but colder now. Mr. Hale, you will follow courtroom procedure, or I will have you removed. I smiled, not out of humor, but because the threat sounded absurd in the wake of what had already happened. Removed again? The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the gallery. A few heads turned. A few whispers broke through the air before the bailiff silenced them. I walked to the evidence table, my briefcase resting there like a soldier's shield. I pulled out the printed invitation and official Bar Association letterhead and placed it in view. This, I said, holding it up, is the reason I was in that building. Signed by the bar president herself, with the seal, dated, and addressed to me by name. The prosecutor objected, claiming irrelevance. Judge Cray sustained it without hesitation. My teeth clenched, but I pressed on. Then allow me to show Exhibit B. From the same folder, I drew several high-resolution still-frame security camera footage I'd obtained through a public records request late last night. The images were damning. Me standing calmly, badge visible, while the guard Judge Cray advanced, hand near his baton. Another frame showed my hands raised, fingers splayed, yet his grip on me tightening. Let the record reflect, I said, that at no point was I aggressive, threatening, or attempting to flee. I complied, and I was still detained without probable cause. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, perhaps expecting him to shut this down again. But his gaze was fixed on the photos, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. He knew the footage was real. He knew the angles too well. That camera had been his watchful eye for years. I slid one more document forward. And here, I said, is the policy manual for building security. Section 4, paragraph 2. All persons with verified conference credentials are permitted access to designated areas, regardless of race, gender, or occupation. That landed heavier than I expected. A few jurors' eyes narrowed. One scribbled a note. It was then that I decided to do something I rarely did as a defense attorney, put the opposing party on the stand. I called Judge Matthew Cray as a witness, I said. Gasps rippled through the room like a sudden draft. Even the prosecutor froze for a beat before objecting. Your Honor, this is improper, but I knew the law here. When the presiding judge is a direct party to the events in question, procedural rules allow for reassignment or recusal. He could try to deny me, but the appeal would crush this entire proceeding. Judge Cray's voice was strained, tight as piano wire. Court will recess for 10 minutes. When we returned, a different judge had taken the bench, a senior visiting judge with a calm face and eyes like sharpened stone. The court has determined that Judge Cray is a material witness in this case, the new judge announced. He will testify under oath. If the air had been heavy before, now it was suffocating. The former security guard, now stripped of the robe, sitting at the witness stand, looked smaller somehow, though his frame hadn't changed. Maybe it was the absence of authority's armor. I approached slowly, each step echoing across the floor. "Mr. Cray," I began, savoring the absence of "Your Honor. Do you recall detaining me yesterday morning?" His voice was measured. "I do." "On what grounds?" "You were in a restricted area without proper clearance." I held up the invitation again. "So this," I said, "wasn't proper clearance." He hesitated. "I didn't see that at the time." "Did you look?" Silence. The gallery leaned in. "Mr. Cray, is it standard procedure to approach suspected trespassers with your hand on your baton?" For officer safety, was I aggressive? No. Did I resist? No. So why, Mr. Cray, did you place me in handcuffs instead of asking a simple question? His gaze faltered for the first time. "Because," he stopped. "Because." I pressed. His eyes flickered toward the jurors, then back to me. "Because. In my experience, people who don't belong in those areas tend to lie. And what about people who do belong there, but happen to look different than you? Do they get treated the same?" The objection from the prosecutor came instantly, but the new judge overruled. The silence that followed was deafening. "I have here," I continued, pulling another sheet from my folder, "a record of every detainment you conducted in the last 3 years as head of building security. Out of 37 incidents, 33 involved people of color. 33. That's 89%. His jaw tightened. "I enforce the rules equally. Do you? Or do you enforce your perception of who should be there?" A juror in the back, middle-aged, white, glasses perched on her nose, crossed her arms and stared at him like she'd just discovered something foul in her drink. I let the pause stretch. "Mr. Cray, yesterday you treated me like a criminal. Today, you sat in judgment of me. Tell this court, if that footage didn't exist, if I didn't have every credential in order, would you still believe you were right?" His answer was quiet, but in the silence it carried. "Yes." The room felt colder after that. The rest of his testimony unraveled him. Every procedure he cited fell apart under the weight of policy manuals and contradicting accounts from other guards. My questions cut sharper than I expected, but each answer confirmed what everyone already suspected. This wasn't about rules. It was about instinct. And his instincts had been poisoned by bias. When I finally stepped back, my pulse was hammering, my throat raw. But the look in the juror's eyes told me the point had landed. The prosecutor tried to patch the damage and redirect, framing his actions as split-second decisions made for safety. But the images on the monitors, the stills of me standing calmly, hands open, badge visible, hung over her words like storm clouds. The new judge dismissed him from the stand, and Cray walked past me without a glance. I didn't need one. His silence was already an admission. In closing, I didn't give them a law lecture. I gave them the truth they'd just seen unfold. "This isn't about me winning or him losing," I said, gesturing toward the empty witness stand. "It's about whether we're willing to accept a world where someone's life can be upended in seconds, based not on their actions, but on the color of their skin. You don't have to be a lawyer to know that's wrong. You just have to be human." The jury left for deliberation. The room exhaled. I sat alone at the defense table, my fingers pressed against the wood grain, breathing in the old scent of varnish and history. I'd been in many trials where the verdict was just a formality. This wasn't one of them. Here, the verdict would be a statement not just about my case, but about whether the truth we'd all witnessed in that room was enough to shake the walls of habit and prejudice. When the jury filed back in less than an hour later, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. The foreperson, a tall black man in his 60s with silver hair and a voice like gravel over velvet, stood with the verdict slip in hand. "In the matter of State versus Hale," he began, "we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The words didn't just land, they detonated. The gallery erupted. A muffled cheer escaped from somewhere in the back before the bailiff barked for order. The prosecutor sat rigid, her lips thin and pale, while I simply closed my eyes and let the verdict wash over me like the first warm air after a long, brutal winter. But even as relief settled into my bones, it came tangled with something heavier, a truth I couldn't ignore. This wasn't vindication for everyone who'd been in my shoes. It was just one case, one fight, one verdict. The system hadn't changed in that hour. The new judge thanked the jury, dismissed the case, and banged the gavel. The sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, signaling not just the end of my trial, but the beginning of something else. I gathered my papers slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of the eyes still on me. And then, through the shuffle of coats and the murmur of voices, I saw him, Judge Cray, standing near the side door. No robe, no bench to hide behind. His posture was stiffer than yesterday, like the verdict had carved a knot into his spine. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before he turned toward the exit. I could have let him walk. God knows I had every reason to leave him in my rearview mirror. But my feet moved before my brain caught up, carrying me toward him through the thinning crowd. "Cray," I said, my voice low but cutting enough to make him stop. He turned, his face unreadable, though his eyes betrayed that familiar flicker of recognition and maybe something close to guilt. "You think this is over?" I asked. His jaw worked. "The court has spoken." "The court spoke because it saw the truth," I said. "But what happens when the truth isn't caught on camera? What happens when the next person you size up doesn't have the time, the resources, or the legal training to fight back?" His silence was heavy. "You sat in judgment of me today," I continued. "But yesterday, you had already judged me before I said a word. You ever wonder how many other verdicts you've given out like that without a robe, without a jury, just based on a feeling you didn't even question?" He swallowed hard. For the first time since this began, he didn't have a ready answer. "I did my job," he said, but it sounded less like a defense and more like a confession. "No," I told him. "You did what you thought your job was. There's a difference." The muscles in his face tightened, but he didn't look away. "You made your point." "Not to you," I said. "Not yet." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "One day, you're going to find yourself standing where I was, power stripped away, reputation on the line, and you're going to realize that what you thought you knew about people like me was wrong. When that day comes, I hope you remember this conversation. I hope you remember my face." I walked away before he could respond. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Microphones sprouted toward me like metal weeds, and the questions came rapid fire. "Mr. Hale, how does it feel to be acquitted? Do you plan to sue the city? What message do you hope this verdict sends?" I held up a hand, waited for the noise to die down. Today's verdict proves that truth still matters. But truth shouldn't need a camera to survive. The real work starts now, changing the rules, changing the people who enforce them, and making sure no one else has to fight this same fight. Flashes popped. The sound of shutters was like distant gunfire. As I descended the steps, I spotted my sister, Amara, standing at the edge of the crowd. She'd been at the trial every day, her presence a quiet anchor. Now she was smiling through tears, her arms opening as I reached her. "You did it," she whispered against my shoulder. "We did it," I corrected. "But it's not over." She pulled back, her eyes searching mine. "You're not going to let this go, are you? Would you?" I asked. She shook her head. "Then I guess we fight." Over the next few weeks, the case took on a life of its own. News segments replayed the footage of my detainment alongside clips of my cross-examination of Cray. Social media turned me into both a rallying point and a target, praise from activists, venom from trolls. But the real surprise came when other stories started surfacing. Former defendants, ex-security staff, even court clerks began to speak out about Cray's history, patterns of bias, questionable rulings, detainments that never made the news. Some accounts were heartbreaking. A Latino teenager accused of loitering while waiting for his mother outside the courthouse. A Muslim woman detained for security screening despite passing through the metal detector without issue. None of them had the resources to fight back. Most just wanted to forget. One morning, I received an unmarked envelope at my office. Inside was a single Pagean official memo from years ago, warning Cray about disproportionate enforcement actions against people of color in his security role. It was signed by a supervisor I recognized, long retired. I read it twice, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just bias, it was documented, warned about, ignored. That night, I called a journalist I trusted. "You want the real story?" I asked. "Meet me at my office tomorrow. Bring a camera." The interview aired 2 days later. The memo was front and center, alongside the footage of my own detainment and the mounting testimonies from others. Public pressure swelled like a storm tide. Within a week, the State Judicial Commission announced an investigation into Cray's conduct both before and during his tenure as a judge. He was placed on administrative leave. I should have felt triumphant. In some ways, I did. But I also felt the weight of knowing that for every Cray who faced consequences, there were dozens, maybe hundreds who wouldn't. A month later, I was back in court, but not as a defendant. This time, I stood at the plaintiff's table, representing a young man named Deshaun who'd been detained by courthouse security under nearly identical circumstances to mine. The officer involved wasn't Cray, but the story was the same. Suspicion without cause, escalation without reason. As I questioned witnesses, presented evidence, and told Deshaun's story, I felt the echoes of my own case resonating in the room. The jurors leaned in the same way. The silence was the same heavy kind. And when the verdict came another not guilty, I realized this was the fight I'd be having for the rest of my career. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't walk away. One evening, months after my trial, I was locking up my office when I saw a figure standing across the street. It was Cray. No robe, no uniform, just a man in a worn coat, his hands in his pockets. We stared at each other for a moment before he crossed the street. "I lost my seat," he said simply. "I know," I replied. "They're still investigating. Probably won't let me back on the bench." I didn't say anything. He took a breath. "You were right. About a lot of things. I thought I was just doing my job. But maybe I was just protecting my version of the world." "Maybe," I said. "What matters is what you do now." His eyes met mine, and for the first time, there wasn't any defensiveness there. Just a man wrestling with himself. "I don't know," he admitted. "Then start by listening," I said. "Really listening. To the people you never thought you needed to hear from." He nodded slowly, then turned to leave. I watched him walk away, his figure fading into the city's shadows, and I wondered if he'd ever truly understand. But whether he did or not, I knew my work wasn't about changing one man. It was about changing the ground we all walked on, the rules, the reflexes, the quiet assumptions that decided so much before anyone spoke a word. Because if this fight had taught me anything, it was this: justice isn't just about verdicts. It's about the moments before the gavel falls, the decisions made in silence, and the courage to challenge them. And I wasn't done yet. The final days of the investigation were a whirlwind. The State Judicial Commission's report was damning, cataloging Cray's repeated misjudgments and bias, and recommending his permanent removal from any judicial or security role. Public response was fierce. Editorials, protests, and calls for systemic reform echoed nationwide. I watched it all unfold from my modest office, the window open to the hum of a restless city. Justice, imperfect and slow, was inching forward. But the fight had changed me. It had sharpened my resolve, peeled back layers of idealism, and replaced it with a fierce, pragmatic hope. A few weeks after Cray's official removal, I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on racial justice in the legal system. Standing before an auditorium packed with lawyers, judges, activists, and students, I recounted my story not as a tale of personal victory, but as a call to action. We must confront the uncomfortable truth that justice is not blind. It sees color, it weighs prejudice, and sometimes it errs in ways that crush lives. I said, my voice steady but charged. But in those errors, we find the seeds of change if we're willing to nurture them. The applause was thunderous, but my gaze was searching the crowd, seeking those who'd carry the message forward. Back home that evening, I sat at my desk reviewing a letter from Deshaun's family. They thanked me for fighting not just his case, but for the larger cause. I thought of the countless others waiting in the wings, people whose stories might never be told unless someone like me stood up. The phone rang. It was Amara. "Big news," she said, excitement crackling in her voice. "The Bar Association just announced a new initiative, an oversight committee to monitor bias in security and court procedures. They want you to be a founding member." I smiled, a warmth spreading through me. It was more than recognition, it was a tangible step toward systemic change. Weeks later, at the first committee meeting, I saw faces from all walks of life. Seasoned attorneys, young activists, even former defendants. The air buzzed with determination. One woman spoke up. "I'm tired of hearing it's just one bad apple. This is a system-wide issue. We need accountability at every level." Heads nodded, including mine. We drafted policies for transparency, mandatory bias training, and channels for reporting misconduct. It wasn't a cure-all, but it was a start. One rainy afternoon, As I left the committee office, a familiar figure appeared by the entrance tray. His presence startled me, but I nodded cautiously. "I wanted to talk," he said, voice quieter than before. We stepped under the awning for shelter. Rain slicked the pavement and blurred the city lights into watery halos. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began. "About what happened. About who I was." I listened, guarded but open. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I just want you to know I'm trying to understand. To change." The words hung between us, fragile as the raindrops falling around. "I believe you," I said finally. His relief was palpable, though I knew the real work lay ahead for both of us, and for everyone caught in the web of prejudice and justice. Before he left, Cray pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this after the trial. Thought you should have it." I unfolded it carefully. Inside was a lettera raw, honest reflection of his failures and hopes for redemption. Months passed. The committee's work gained momentum. Stories like mine and Deshawn's became catalysts, sparking reforms in courts across the state. One afternoon, standing outside the courthouse where it all began, I felt the weight of history and the promise of progress settle over me. A young black lawyer approached, nervous but determined. "Mr. Hale," she said, "thank you for showing me it's possible to fight, even when the odds are stacked." I smiled. "Keep fighting. That's how change happens." As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting golden hues over the city, I thought about the journey from being wrongfully detained, to standing trial, to shaping the future of justice. The fight was far from over, but the tide was turning. And in that turning, I found hope. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.